in Acts chapter 23, verse 1. Shaul looked straight at them and said to the Sanhedrin, "Brothers, I have been discharging my obligations to God with a perfectly clear conscience right up until today. But the high priest, Hananiah, ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. Then Shaul said to him, 'God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Will you sit there judging me according to the Torah, yet in violation of the Torah order me to be struck?' The men nearby said, 'This is the high priest of God that you're insulting.' And Saul said, 'I didn't know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it says in the Torah, you are not to speak disparagingly of a ruler of your people.' But knowing that one part of the Sanhedrin consisted of the Sadducees, the Sadducees, and the other of the Prushim, the Pharisees, Shaul shouted, 'Brothers, I myself am a Pharisee and the son of Pharisees, and it is concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I am being tried.' When he said this, an argument arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the crowd was divided. For the Sadducees deny the resurrection and the existence of angels and spirits, whereas the Pharisees acknowledge both. So there was a great uproar with some of the Torah teachers who were on the side of the Pharisees standing up and joining in and said, 'We don't find anything wrong with this man. And if a spirit or an angel spoke to him, what of it?' The dispute became so violent that the commander, fearing that Shaul would be torn apart by the mob, ordered the soldiers to go down and take him by force and bring him back into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, 'Take courage, for just as you have borne a faithful witness to me in Jerusalem, so now you must bear witness in Rome.' And the next day, some of the Judeans formed a conspiracy. They took an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Shaul. More than 40 were involved in this plot. They went to the head Kohanim and the elders and said, 'We have bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Shaul. What you are to do is make it appear to the commander that you and the Sanhedrin want to get more accurate information about Shaul's case, so that he will bring him down to you, while we, for our part, are prepared to kill him before he even gets here.' But the son of Shaul's sister got wind of the planned ambush, and he went into the barracks and told Shaul. And Shaul called one of the officers and said, 'Take this man to the commander. He has something to tell him.' So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, 'The prisoner Shaul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you.' The commander took him by the hand and led him privately aside and asked, 'What do you have to tell me?' He said, 'The Judeans have agreed to ask you tomorrow to bring Shaul down to the Sanhedrin on the pretext that they want to investigate his case more thoroughly. But don't let yourself be talked into it, because more than 40 men are lying in wait for him. They have taken an oath neither to eat nor to drink until they have killed him, and they are ready now, only waiting for you to give your consent to their request.' The commander let the young man go, cautioning him, 'Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me.' Then he summoned 2 of the captains and said, 'Get 250 infantry soldiers ready to leave for Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight, and 70 mounted cavalry and 200 spearmen. Also provide replacements for Shaul's horse when it gets tired, and bring him through safely to Felix the governor.' And the commander wrote the following letter: From Claudius Lysias to His Excellency Governor Felix. Greetings. This man was seized by the Judeans and was about to be killed by them when I came to the rescue with my troops and rescued him. I came on the scene with my troops and rescued him. After learning that he was a Roman citizen, I wanted to understand exactly what they were charging him with, so I brought him down to their Sanhedrin. I found that he was charged in connection with questions of their Torah, but that there was no charge deserving death or prison. But when I was informed of a plot against the man, I immediately sent him to you and ordered his accusers to state their case against him before you. So the soldiers, following their orders, took Shaul during the night and brought him to Antipatris. then returned to the barracks after leaving the cavalry to go on with him. The cavalry took him to Caesarea, delivered the letter to the governor, and handed over Shaul. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. On learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will give you a full hearing after your accusers also have arrived," and ordered him to be kept under guard in Herod's headquarters. So, there you have it. A little bit of political intrigue here, and some court proceedings are going on and are about to... pretty much the remainder of this book is court proceedings. There's a whole lot of prison transportation and little hearings here and there. So that's all what's happened in the remainder of this book is basically Paul on trial. So now he starts his address to the Sanhedrin by saying, "I have discharged my obligations to the best of my ability, and my conscience bearing me witness to this very day of my whole life." Now, I wonder have you guys thought about what is he talking about when he says, "I have, discharged my obligations to the best of my ability my whole life"? What do you think he's talking about? Yeah, Keith?
Follow Torah?
Yes, I would assume so. He's lived his life with a clear conscience before God. Being a Pharisee, you would assume that he had followed the dictates of not only the Torah of Moses, but the dictates of the Sanhedrin and the dictates of the Pharisees in the synagogue system. When he testified in the previous chapter 21 that he had lived according to the strictest sect of the Pharisees, and apparently still did. So he seems to be telling them, "I have lived with a clear conscience my whole life." Now, it's interesting about living life with a clean conscience. Do you guys remember that segment in the book of Peter about appealing to God for a clean conscience? Do you remember that passage? Anybody remember that?
They said, "Make a clean conscience in me, O Lord."
That's a different passage, but that's definitely, that's a great one. But Peter was talking about baptism. He was making a figure of speech saying, "Baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a clean conscience." Do you recognize that passage from 1 Peter? It's fascinating because he is equating baptism with an appeal to God for a clean conscience. In what way would you say that baptism might be considered an appeal to God for a clean conscience? And what is a clean conscience anyway? I mean, Paul is saying, "I have a clean conscience." What does that mean?
Don't make you feel guilty of anything you did.
You're unaware of anything for which you might be or should be guilty. Does that mean he's without sin?
No.
Not necessarily, no. But he is...
As he stands before the Lord.
Yeah. As he stands before God, he's saying, "I don't have anything to be ashamed of. I have lived my life," as he said in the previous chapters, "I've lived my life in accord with the strictest sect of religion." But you also have heard him say, "All of the things that I had achieved in my life of works, I consider to be rubbish now that I have come to know God through the Messiah, Yeshua." So Paul has a clean conscience, but he's also making a categorical statement that he's not guilty of anything. Now, do we know what they are accusing him of having done? What was his What was his? What were the charges against him?
His belief in the resurrection.
What's that?
His belief in the resurrection.
Well, he says that in front of the Sanhedrin, but we don't have any argument. We don't have any record of any argument going on between him and anybody else regarding the resurrection. It's interesting to note, there's so much confusion regarding Paul and what was happening here, because they're accusing him of certain things. In the next chapter, they'll start to bring formal charges and say, we find him to be guilty of this and this and this and that. Some of those things that they charge him with aren't even crimes, and they can't prove anything. They're accusing him of disrupting the temple service and bringing Gentiles into the temple, restricted.
That bothered me.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, except it wasn't even true. They didn't find him in the temple with anybody, except for the people who were under the Nazirite vow who needed to shave their heads. I mean, there wasn't any Gentiles with him. But the interesting thing is that he's saying, my conscience is clear. I have done nothing to anyone that would cause anybody to freak out. But remember, when he was making his appeal to the people, that he gave his whole testimony and said, I was a member of the Pharisees, and I got letters from the chief priests to go around and arrest people and put in prison and whip and scourge people who were believers in this way. And I was very zealous for the law and the traditions of the elders. But then he relates how Yeshua appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and he related how he was healed of his blindness, and how, but right when he got to the part of the story when he says, I'm sending you away to the Gentiles, that's when they freaked out. Now, why is that? Because they seem to be listening to his testimony right up until he said, God told me that I'm supposed to go to the Gentiles. Why would that freak them out? And consider also that when he was on his missionary journeys, that he would go and he would be telling them about the Messiah Yeshua. And that's the only issue that we really hear about when he's in all of these Jewish synagogues throughout Asia Minor, is he's reasoning with them and arguing with them and trying to convince them that Yeshua is the Messiah and that the prophets predicted that he would suffer and die. So the only issues that we seem to have here that we can tell he was literally arguing about with people is Jesus the Messiah? And the second issue is going to the Gentiles. Now, we understand why he would be arguing with Jews about whether Jesus is the Messiah, right? Yeah. What is the biggest issue? I don't mean today, but I mean, what would be the biggest issue that the Jews would have with Jesus being the Messiah?
They think they killed him.
What's that?
They refused him.
No, but I mean, why would they reject him? Why did they reject him?
They feel culpable for having killed Messiah.
But not the Jews out in the diaspora.
He wasn't.
Did away with the Torah.
Okay, but that's true. Hold on a sec.
He wasn't the leader or the person that they were looking for. They were looking for somebody to lead.
Yes, that I think is the biggest issue. Keith?
Well, no, I was sort of going the way of Tracy, is because all the rumors have it that Yeshua was trying to, because he, with all his run-ins with the Pharisees and everything, and Shaul was following him, and Shaul was the same way, that he was trying to change things. Mm-hmm. But then, up to this point, this was where he was trying to make amends with, he already done the thing in the Torah with those other believers, right?
Yeah.
But then, from what I read, then he was taken outside the temple. Then they were going to beat him and kill him, and then of course the Romans keep intervening, trying to figure out what's going on. Yeah. Because they're oblivious to all this religious stuff. They just say, "Okay, here we'll put you in front of somebody that can judge this," and then they drag him away, and then they're just like the intermediaries trying to solve this uproar. Yeah. They don't want it in their city.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this is complicated by the fact that Paul is a Roman citizen and was born a Roman citizen and is from a fairly prominent city of Cilicia, or Tarsus, from the province of Cilicia, which I think I had mentioned to you previously that They kind of had a city ranking, and if you're from one of the bigger, more important cities, then you are recognized as being from that city. And so I guess the city of Tarsus was fairly well known as a great place of learning, and that when Paul tells people he's a Roman citizen who was born that way from the city of Tarsus, that carries some weight. Yes, sir.
Is it the same Tarsus as today?
I don't know that there is a Tarsus today. In Turkey, is there?
Yeah, the Soviets have a port in the Mediterranean in Tarsus.
That's probably the same place, if I had to
It's
guess.
the only place they can...
That's a deep water port, right? Yeah, okay. I remember hearing about that. Yeah, absolutely. So the issue, I think, with the Jews at this time that Paul is going out into the diaspora and explaining to people that he thinks Jesus is the Messiah, the biggest problem is what you were saying, Lou, and that is that this is not the Messiah that they were waiting for. This Messiah died and was resurrected, we'll grant you that, but that's not what we were hoping for. We were waiting for the Messiah ben David, who's going to come and destroy all our enemies and establish the kingdom of God. So this death and resurrection is a big stumbling block, and I think that's why we're having this big discussion about I'm on trial for believing in the resurrection of the dead, and we'll get to that in a sec, but go ahead, Jim.
There's a book that's written by an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, and they say today, maybe they didn't say it back then, that Messiah ben Yosef, Messiah the son of Joseph, is going to suffer and die, and then Messiah ben David shortly thereafter, I don't know where they get the shortly thereafter, is going to make him resurrected, and together they are going to purge the world of the Esau spirit, and Messiah ben David is going to rule.
Yeah. That's
why
still, I mean, that's...
back then, the point is why back then they weren't looking for Messiah ben Joseph to come first, which is the suffering Messiah.
Yeah.
To come before why they would back then not have it right.
It's a good question, and I would say, here's let me paint a picture for you and see if you can comprehend this, and just get down on this for a second. It's kind of interesting. What if a guy appeared and he was a Jew and he was performing great works and miracles and he was doing some wonderful things, and it just didn't happen like we were expecting? We're expecting Yeshua to come in the clouds with power and authority and for him to destroy the nations. We're waiting right now for exactly what they were waiting for then, right? Now, what if, in God's infinite wisdom, something happens in this world in the coming years and it is nothing like we thought it was going to be? And then some prophets start coming around and explaining to you, using the scriptures, that, yeah, this was all prophesied. It had to happen this way. And the Spirit of God opens your eyes and you can see, oh my gosh, I had never seen that.
Yeah.
Now, I know that sounds scary to some of you because many of you might be thinking, well, isn't that what the Antichrist is going to do?
Exactly.
Yeah, potentially. So you better know your scriptures and you better know the Spirit of God. But I want you just to place yourself in that boat for just a moment. That all of us have our hopes set on Jesus coming in the clouds with power and great glory and lightning east and west, destroying, we got the great tribulation and all that. But what if by some, and I'm not saying this would happen, I'm asking you to place yourself into these people's footsteps by imagining that something completely different than what you're all expecting were to happen. And then prophets of God are going around and showing you in your scriptures just exactly like is happening to you now, where you're reading through your Bible and going, wow, how did I miss the fact that I'm supposed to be keeping the commandments of God? I mean, it's smacking you in the face your whole life, and suddenly you're reading your Bible and you're going, how did I miss that? It's hitting you in the face the whole time. I think that's exactly what's happening here, where they were fully expecting exactly what we're expecting. For the king to show up and establish the kingdom. And when it didn't happen like they wanted, they weren't happy about it. And God, through His Spirit, had to open their eyes to see what the Scripture actually said. That was not my plan from the beginning. I had a different plan than what you had. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus isn't going to come in the clouds with great glory. I do believe that he is going to do that. But I'm not God. I don't get to decide what happens. But I think that's the big issue here.
But the thing, it's just like, well, even when he comes with the big cloud, I mean, just say he just appears in the cloud. There's going to be some of us that still don't believe.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely there is. You ain't kidding. You ain't kidding. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, there's great confusion, and there always has been. But I think we mentioned previously that we've just got a couple of issues here. We've got people spreading rumors about Paul. Just such a lightning rod, such a controversial figure. I mean, they're spreading rumors saying, hey, this guy doesn't observe the Torah, and he's telling people, talking trash about Moses, talking trash about the temple. Man, he took Gentiles in the temple. He's telling people out there, he's telling Jews out in the diaspora, don't circumcise your children. None of this stuff is true. And here we are. We're dealing with this because of it. But he's saying, my conscience is clear. I have been following the Torah and the traditions of the elders. So he says, you don't have anything against me. So, yes.
Could this be because they're such against him because at one time he was one of them?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I do think so.
All of a sudden, he's preaching a different, he's telling a different story.
Absolutely.
They don't want anybody else, any other Jew to believe him because he's a Jew.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big part of it is that there's a certain sense of betrayal. And I think that we've talked before about how their social structure was organized, and that we have some zealots. I don't think that in our minds today, we read about this Judas the zealot, or there are certain zealots in the Bible, in the New Testament. I don't think we quite understand what that is.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? They were not nice. They were willing to fight and die. Some of the like the words that we use in our culture, like the word assassin, actually comes from them. And I think that these 40 guys, it says 40 were involved in the conspiracy. I don't know that all 40 of them were ready to, kill Paul, but some were, obviously. Absolutely. And the Sicarii are these guys who, carry long knives hidden in their robes, and they just walk up to Roman citizens and people who are collaborating with Rome and, stab them real quick and run away, and they never get caught. This place is a foment of rebellion. It's fomenting a tremendous amount of rebellion and rioting. And you've got these Jews who are fiercely nationalistic. You think that America is divided today with social justice warriors out there throwing bricks and the right-wingers, skinheads, nationalists, whoever they are, out there fighting in the streets? That's nothing compared to what you see going on here. They hated the Romans. These Jews are fiercely nationalistic, and they do not like Gentiles. And I personally think that Paul was one of them. I think that Paul was one of them to the extent like you're talking about, where he was a hyper-partisan. So much so that he is willing to go and hunt down and scourge and jail and possibly even kill people who got out of line with religious orthodoxy.
Well, it says right here that he stood by while they were stoning Stephen.
Absolutely. So he is a hardcore partisan. And I think that these people who are now in the crowd shouting, that man does not deserve to live, they are his former compatriots who are fiercely nationalistic, and that's why they freaked out when he said, God has sent me to the Gentiles. So that you can't do that. The Gentiles are unclean, right?
Yeah, but there are, well anyway, I've heard a lesson that these Jews, not only in this place, but they were following him, a lot of around all the time and accusing him.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We saw it in some of the previous chapters when he'd go, there would be a little bit of activity in this city where he's hanging out, and he'd go to the next city and they'd follow him there to go and cause more trouble. Absolutely.
I want to say something in defense of their radical position.
You don't have to defend it to me.
Oh, well, a couple of
I'm there, buddy.
a couple of times because the Jewish people allowed themselves to be won over by the nations around them.
Sure.
And do life their way.
Well, you have the example of Phineas.
Phineas, yeah, God bless him.
God did bless him.
Stabbing those people, they were screwing around, they pinned them together into the ground.
That's a zealot.
Yeah, that's
And he was commended by God for that.
Yeah.
Now, I am, and you know what? I am not advocating that you take up arms and go kill people who don't believe in God. That's ridiculous.
For the record.
For the record, yes. Just for everyone who's listening on the internet, I am not advising that you take up arms. No, but seriously, I think you're absolutely right, Jimmy. That, Paul is one of those guys, and I'm not.
They're not
it's tough.
Like the Gentiles, they have to be different.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you love people when you're nervous about them screwing you up and making you go into exile for decades?
Well, I don't know that. No, I understand that the fiercely partisan would say we have to stay strictly separate from the world. And frankly, I think that we in America and in the West have really just been steeped in it. We have taken on a lot of the world's culture. I know that here, those of us here try to guard ourselves as best we can, but we're not hyper-partisans by any stretch. I would suggest to you, unfortunately, that Mormons are way more hyper-partisan than many Christian I've ever met. Mm-hmm. Those people take holiness seriously, such as it is. They take seriously their desire to not be contaminated by the world more than most Christians I know.
Yep.
It's unfortunate. Were you going to?
Like a condition of the heart.
It is, but and I'm not saying that people who believe of that persuasion or any persuasion are right. I'm simply saying some people are zealous for God and take their holiness, their kedoshim, seriously. Most people that I know don't, and I would drop myself right into that category of not being especially set apart. What is it that sets me apart? My seat? The fact that I worship on Shabbat? Yes, to a degree. But how different from... Now that separates me from most Christians.
That also separates you with the seal of
The
God.
whole world.
I agree with you that is a seal. But I'm dealing with my own conscience. I cannot, like Paul, say, I have been discharging my obligations with a clean conscience before God. I cannot say that. I would not be in that position to say that. I have a lot of work to do, and I know that you guys do too. None of us are where we'd like to be. But these guys are taking that struggle very, very seriously. And they see Paul mingling with the Gentiles, sharing the faith, and I think, based on some things that happen in the next chapter, I think that he is starting to, if he hasn't already, put aside some of the traditions of the elders. I see him doing that. Not the Torah, but the traditions of the elders. The traditions that he was raised with as a Pharisee that says, you can't flip a light switch, you can't, do this and that and 100 other things.
He never flicked a light switch and he didn't have 2 refrigerators.
That's right. So I think that he I think that he is very likely being condemned, and people are freaking out about him due to his commingling with the Gentiles, and possibly also starting to depart from the tradition of the elders, I think, based on one thing that happens in the next chapter. So he is struck by the high priest for saying that. Why? Why does the high priest order him struck? Did he say something wrong?
Is that like a blasphemy?
He didn't. He just said, brethren, I have done my best. I have a clean conscience. Bam! Smack him in his face. There's nothing that I can come up with anywhere in the Torah, anywhere in the traditions of if you can read the tractate Sanhedrin in the Mishnah and the Talmud, doesn't have any restrictions on speech like that. But you know what's interesting is they did the exact same thing to Jesus.
Yeah.
If you look at John chapter 18, verse 19, it says the exact same thing happened. Only they began to ask Yeshua questions, and he just answers their questions and said, well, which is kind of interesting because they're like trying to get information from Jesus about what he's teaching. He's like, well, go talk to the people out there in the streets and the temple. They were there. They heard me. Why are you asking me? Why would he say that? What are you asking me for?
What's testimony?
He's not supposed to testify on his own behalf. I mean, he can defend himself, but he's saying, where are your witnesses? You're questioning me about what I said. Shouldn't you have witnesses that are here to tell you what I said? 2 or 3. But they smack him for saying that. And he responds exactly like Paul does, saying, well, not like Paul. Paul was a little more of a firebrand. God's going to just kill you whitewashed wall. Now, it didn't happen exactly the same way, but really similar. Now, did Paul curse the high priest?
No, but there's at the end of this, maybe I'm too simple. There's 3 words here.
Yes.
To this day.
From verse 1.
Yes.
Okay.
He said it's kind of to this day.
Yes.
Now, according to the high priest, that's not true. And he slapped him right in the mouth.
Okay.
Not up to this day because he's going to the Gentiles.
But there's no rule in the Torah about going to the Gentiles.
I know, but if I don't believe this and my son says something to me like that, I'm going to smack him in the mouth.
Okay. All right. It's possible. It's possible. But I think Paul knows the Torah.
Yeah.
But he says, do you sit there judging me according to the Torah, and in violation of the Torah you order me to be struck? So he's clearly saying you have violated the Torah by having me struck. Keith?
Yeah, if they go by the oral Torah, which says you can go deal with Gentiles.
That's true. That is true. But however, interesting to note, this is where things get complicated, is remember who the high priest is. Hananiah. He's a Sadducee. They do not believe in the oral Torah. So it's kind of hard to say he's being slapped in his face because of violating the oral Torah when the high priest does not buy into oral Torah at all.
He's violating their culture.
Cultural norms, but the high priests, they are totally in cahoots with Rome. How can they? Now, that could just be hypocrisy. We're definitely on board with just being some straight-up hypocrisy. But it seems a little weird that they would be saying, oh, yeah, we're not supposed to mingle with Romans and Gentiles, but the high priests are fully in bed with the Romans. Many of them are appointed by the Romans and are serving at the behest of the Romans.
Yeah, but they think they're above the Romans, of course.
Of course,
they're
yes.
only doing it politically, but yeah, they wouldn't go into a Gentile's house trying to convert him.
Yeah, yes.
You know what I'm
With
saying?
that, I would
That's what
tend.
Paul's doing. Paul's going and meeting and eating with them and converting
Yeah,
them.
yeah. Well, I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, definitely. So, but does he curse the high priest?
No.
Yes, he did curse him.
Oh, he's the whitewash.
God will strike you.
Oh, yeah,
He did. He actually cursed the high priest.
You're right.
It's a little bit of a prophetic utterance. God will strike you. He was literally calling down the wrath of God on the high priest.
Yeah, and that word that I think maybe you have translated as blasphemy, I don't know, is just revile, to vilify, revile, reproach. So yeah, I mean, that's what he was doing.
Yeah, he was.
But that was in ignorance, because had he known, he wouldn't have done that.
And, there's great puzzling over the fact that Paul did not recognize the high priest. How could this be? Well, people, and you got this. It's interesting that when you look at this episode in John chapter 18, it says the high priest Hananiah Ananias, ordered him struck in the face. Is this the same high priest? According to the historical records, it's not. Between the period of Yeshua and this time period right here, there were 18 high priests. They was not the same guy. Now you might, yeah, they got a high turnover rate. So you wonder about how is it that Paul didn't know this guy? Because he had received letters from the high priest to go and persecute these Christians, but then you recognize he hasn't been in this area for some time. How long was he out on his missionary journeys? According to everything that we know, it was at least 20 years. So a lot. It could have been 5 or 6 high priests during that time. You never know. But I don't think he was lying when he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize that he was the high priest." I think he didn't know. Now, the high priest is supposed to wear some type of distinguishing garb. Certainly he would have known about that distinguishing garb, but others have suggested, well, this might have been a more informal meeting of the Sanhedrin, and that they weren't in full regalia, full open court. This was kind of exigent circumstances, where we're kind of holding an impromptu court here, and that's why the high priest was not identifiable. But he did curse the high priest, but he repented immediately and said, "I'm sorry, brothers, I didn't know," because it says in the Torah that you're not supposed to curse the ruler of your people.
I would hope that under these circumstances, it just makes me a little nervous that the Holy Spirit wasn't working with Paul and warning him. And, I mean, when you're doing stuff that's in the Bible, this intense, I would just kind of hope that the Holy Spirit would help me out.
Yeah. You mean, Paul, keep your mouth shut?
Yeah, give him a little word like, hey,
Keith?
Wait, if Yeshua's standing beside him in spirit, he's going to give it to him.
Well, that could be. Angela?
At this point, isn't that guy actually not the high priest?
Hananiah? It says he is.
No, the high priest at this point, isn't it Yeshua? I mean, Stephen's standing at the right hand of God. Isn't that
Yes, but if you want to go according to the book of Hebrews, that is a different kind of a high priest. That's a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek.
Which supersedes whoever this guy is, who was probably appointed in the wrong way anyway.
I totally agree that I do not suggest that this guy is a legitimate high priest.
son of Aaron.
Yeah, I don't think he's a Levite at all, as far as I know.
That he's, because doesn't Paul also say in Hebrews that if he were here, he wouldn't be, that he's the high priest in heaven.
Yeah.
The order of Melchizedek.
Right.
But if he was on earth, as an earthly priest, he would have to be a Levite.
Right. Yes, absolutely. So I don't think that these guys are actually Levitical at all. Definitely not. I don't even think they're Levitical, let alone from the family of Aaron.
Yeah, I think that goes back to like when these same individuals, different but same, were questioning Messiah about what authority he had to do these things. Basically, they're wanting to know what man's authority do you have.
Right.
And then his question back to them, well, I'll ask you a question, and what about John
Yeah,
Baptist?
right.
What's his authority from men or from God?
Yep.
So he's a Levite, he's out in the wilderness, and look where you are.
That's
why,
right.
Why is that? And they couldn't answer. So,
Good point. Keith?
I don't think they had sons of Zadok or Levites in the temple since the Maccabees' time. After that, they ran them all out. And
Yeah.
then the
Yeah.
Hasmonean dynasty came in.
I tend
None
to...
of them were
I tend to agree with that. I think Professor Rachel Elior is correct. Possibly some interesting theories about the what's happening in the time of the Maccabees and how the Hasmoneans are going off and running the show, and the Zadokites are running off to form this desert community of Qumran. It's certainly interesting theories.
Ever since Caiaphas,
Ever since Caiaphas?
things were getting weird. And it was the appointee situation with Rome
Oh.
was getting strange.
Oh, yeah. Well, it had been, according to some of the latest theories, that had been happening since the time of the Maccabees. We're talking about that's going on for 100 years, that there had not really been a Levitical high priest in Jerusalem for almost 100 years. That's certainly possible. From what we know, it is certainly possible. So he does definitely curse this high priest. But I understand what you guys were talking about here, saying, I did not recognize he was the high priest, because he's saying not I didn't recognize you, but I don't recognize your authority to be a high priest. There's every possibility that that's exactly what he meant. But then why would he say, I'm sorry, brothers, I didn't mean that, I didn't know it was that guy, he says you're not supposed to curse or rule with your people. And I think this goes back to, what'd you say, Michael? Oh,
I didn't say anything. I was just thinking. No, I was thinking that he didn't repent for not respecting what the high priest was saying. He repented for not respecting that position.
Yes, that's a good point, because this is right up Paul's alley in Romans chapter 15, where he's talking about being an authority to governments, that all leadership is established by God. And so if these people are the high priest, it's because that's where God wants them to be. So if he's rebelling against them, then he's rebelling against God. He knows that.
One more point that just occurred to me, Mike, is is that so many people say that Paul is dispensing with Judaism, and here's kind of a proof that he's like, I don't want to throw away Judaism. I didn't know that guy was a high priest. And he capitulates and repents of it, and he's like, I don't want to do anything to destroy Judaism.
Yeah.
What's written in the Torah, this. He's still holding the Torah right there.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a good point. Good point, you guys. So so Paul is a Pharisee, and I don't believe. So a lot of commentators think he's just saying this to stir up trouble. No, he's not below stirring up trouble. Seriously, I wouldn't put that past him. But I don't think when he notices, I think that it's possible that he realized here, with the way this proceeding even begins, with him making an opening statement, getting slapped in his face, and then he immediately recognizes this is not going to go well for me. This is not going to be a fair hearing. They're already violating the Torah, ordering me to be struck in the face just when I make my opening statements. And so he recognizes maybe my best strategy is to pit my enemies against each other. And I can't say that that's a bad idea, but I don't say that he pretended to be a Pharisee in order to get them fighting with each other. I don't believe that, because he has on multiple occasions said, I am a Pharisee, and I came from a family of Pharisees, and I think he means that.
You're right, in verse 6 he says, I am a Pharisee.
Yeah, and I don't think that causes a lot of Christian commentators problems, because they can't imagine Paul at this time in his life having spent the last 20 years, or possibly even more. I mean, we look at his, from Galatians, where he tells his history, where he was converted on the Damascus Road and then spent some time in Arabia and then went back to Damascus. We could be talking, he's been a Christian now for, it could be 25 years. So, and yet to, at this point, still say, I'm a Pharisee. I think we have to recognize, and those of you who have studied some of the writings of Judaism have recognized that the rabbis and some people who practice Judaism they're doing a pretty good job. They're totally missing the Messiah, unfortunately, but they have the heart for God, and they are following his instructions as best they can, and they are not hypocrites. And we can't just paint with a big brushstroke and say all of these Pharisees are wicked, vile hypocrites. We know that the many, I don't even know if it was many, we know that some in the leadership of the Pharisees were hypocrites, because they were fighting with Yeshua, and Yeshua called them out on their hypocrisy. But we can't then say, I think that you're seeing exactly what happens with the world talking about Christians a lot of time. That's what the number one complaint against the world against Christians is, all a bunch of hypocrites. You can't paint all Christians with that brush and say they're all hypocrites. There are some who are. There are some leaders in the Christian church who are hypocrites. There are people sitting in the pews who are hypocrites. But the fact is, we can't just say all Pharisees are hypocrites, because Paul is a Pharisee. We read in Acts chapter 10 and 15 that there were a whole bunch of Pharisees who are now believers. In fact, we know today there are Pharisees who are believers. You remember, I don't know if you've read, there's a rabbi who's a hardcore rabbi. He just barely speaks English, got one of these big old beards. He's full-on Orthodox. Rabbi Ariel Aloro Cohen. Full-on Messianic. Believes that Jesus is the Messiah. And he lives in Jerusalem and is a hardcore Hasidic Jew. And you can find him on YouTube. Unfortunately, they're terrible. Somebody's filming them like with a cell phone. And you can just barely hear him, and he already doesn't speak very good English at all. But he'll give you his testimony about how Jesus is the Messiah today. He's a hardcore Pharisaic rabbi. He lives according to all the strictest rules of the Pharisees, flipping light switches and not driving in the car and all these other things. Is that wrong? No, it's not wrong. If that's how he wants to live his life and that's what he was brought up in, and he wants to adhere to the strictest sect of the Pharisees like Paul did, do I think he could maybe experience a little bit of freedom? I think so, but who am I to judge? He might look at me.
Override God's commands.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yes, exactly. As long as they're not to the degree that they're trying to keep some Pharisaical or rabbinic law or tradition that violates one of the commandments of God, I would say, who cares what they do? You can come up with any kind of traditions you want as long as they don't violate God's commandments or you elevate them to the status of God's commandments. So I think we just don't want to paint with a huge brush. He absolutely is a Pharisee, and I don't think he was just saying this to pit his enemies against each other. I think that was a good strategy, and it worked, because the Pharisees are saying, we don't find anything wrong with this guy. Imagine that. That's a little bit unusual. I wouldn't have expected that utterance to come out of them, but some of the leaders of the Pharisees in the Sanhedrin said, we don't find anything wrong with this guy. There's nothing wrong with him.
That's like what Pilate said about Jesus.
It's really similar to what Pilate said about Yeshua. It's the same thing that Claudius Lysias, the Roman commander, it's the same thing that the Felix, the Roman governor, will say. And then the guy after him, I don't remember, Porcius, we don't find anything wrong with this guy. But you guys have a rather esoteric series of rules and regulations that we have no idea about. So, go on and deal with it yourself. And Paul's like, don't turn me over to them. I'm a Roman citizen. I appeal to Caesar. I don't want to be held in trial with these guys. So I think that, he knows what he's doing. I want to briefly talk to you about the issue of resurrection in the Bible. This is a rather interesting discussion, and I think that we've talked about this just briefly before, but what is your understanding regarding the Old Testament view of resurrection? Well, I see that you're stumped. Certainly someone has something to say. Jimmy?
Joel, the book of
Olstein?
Job, the book of Job, they take a little weird esoteric passage and they make out of it that reincarnation is part of God's reality for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how they can put reincarnation and the resurrection together. I think it would, got to pick one or the other. I don't.
Yeah. Well, I think that according to the rabbinic tradition, a soul has tikkun, restoration to make, and if you don't make it during this life, you're going to do it. You're going to finish it in another life, and then at the end of that, you'll be resurrected, and that's where it gets a little fuzzy.
I don't know if it would qualify, but it talks about how when the patriarchs and stuff would die, they'd be gathered to their people.
Yes.
And of course, Messiah's words told in the Old Testament is that Moses says he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not the God of the
Right.
living.
Right.
But that's New Testament.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Absolutely, Keith.
I think in Daniel mentions raised and we stand judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Some will, the righteous and the wicked, some will rise to everlasting life.
Right.
Some to everlasting
Right,
contempt.
right. Good. That's a good one. That's a good one. You know, this is a really challenging and difficult section. You know that it is actually. I heard something a couple of months back, with some guy who had thoroughly researched this idea of resurrection in Judaism. Who had kind of tried to look at the issue of resurrection and what happens when you die from the Torah and the prophets and the writings. And he made some comments regarding the Psalms of David. You know, you will not let your servant, my soul will not be, left in the dirt and such like this. But also, being gathered to the fathers and Abraham, the bosom of Abraham. And it was a very interesting proposal that suggested that what was actually happening is that if you died in God before Yeshua, that you were taken to, unfortunately, what the Catholics would consider purgatory.
Yes.
Only they called it the bosom of Abraham, and the Greeks would call it Hades. It's just the place of the dead, and that there was a fixed gulf separating Sheol in Hebrew, yes, the grave, the ground, and that you've got the bosom of Abraham for the followers of God over here, and you've got whatever this other place is over here, and there's a fixed gulf, and they can see each other or somehow, but they cannot cross over, and that these souls in this holding place, that when Yeshua got crucified, that he went and spoke to those spirits in prison and took them with him to heaven. Now, what's interesting is the book of 2 Peter says that he made proclamation to the spirits now in prison who were disobedient in the days of Noah. And some people are like, well, that's like the Nephilim or something, the fallen angel spirits that are in some weird holding place. But it was interesting because the way that you look at the language in 2 Peter, it doesn't say that these were evil spirits that were in prison since the days of Noah. I thought that too. But what you got to recognize is that anybody who was before Noah was dead. The whole place was wiped out with Noah. And I thought, I wonder if that's possible. I don't know that I believe that, but it's certainly a fascinating theory that this guy kind of concocted. And he didn't just come up with it on his own. He was kind of an amalgamation of researching Jewish literature and Christian literature and suggesting that this issue at this time period that we're reading about was really a hot topic. And that Yeshua, the statements of Yeshua were uncategorical and straight up and saying there is a resurrection of the dead. Everyone will be resurrected. The Pharisees kind of seem to have had the opinion that only the righteous were going to be raised from the dead. But Yeshua and Paul is saying that everyone is going to be resurrected from the dead, not just the righteous.
Wasn't the ones that trusted in God, there was a salvation there without the Savior.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the ones that would be saved.
Yeah. Jimmy?
My understanding is that when Jesus was resurrected, and he had to be because his murder was so unjust. He was the only person.
Well, he was without sin.
The only person who should not have died.
Sure.
And so when he was resurrected, it's like he kicked a hole in paradise. and the bad guys on the other side, their compartment stayed. And it's continuing to get filled every time a person who's against the Lord dies. They go there and stay. But I believe when the righteous die, they go through that pathway, and paradise is empty, and it's on the way to heaven, and their spirit goes with the Lord, and because they don't stay there anymore.
Yeah.
When Jesus was resurrected, all those Old Testament saints were stumbling around Jerusalem, waiting for him to get called out.
That's interesting.
But wasn't it true though, when Jesus died and then he began to resurrect, there was Moses and there was Elijah there, which shows that they also was a part in the resurrection, or they wouldn't have been seen.
Well, he hadn't Moses and Elijah appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration, but he hadn't died and been resurrected yet. But that's not a problem necessarily, because the same thing happened with the prophet Samuel. Remember that King Saul went to that witch of Endor and raised Samuel from the dead. He came out of wherever his spirit was. So Moses and Elijah apparently did the same thing. I don't know. This is obviously much speculation, but I only bring it up to make the point that in this time period that we're talking about, this is a highly contentious issue. And Yeshua seems to have made some powerful and categorically unequivocal statements regarding resurrection from the dead, that it is going to happen, and that the righteous and the unrighteous will be resurrected, and that Paul uses this fact of hyper-partisanship on this particular issue. I can't imagine how, well, no, I can imagine how, because when you look at the idea that the Sadducees would look at the scriptures of Moses as being the only valid scriptures, they would probably look at the Psalms and the prophets and the writings in the same way that we look at the Apocrypha. It's interesting. Might have a little truth in there, but we're not calling that scripture. We're not living our lives by it. There's some fantastical stuff there. All I have been able to discover, the Sadducees are fairly mysterious. There's not a lot of historical data about them. The only real information we have about the Sadducees comes from Josephus, who characterizes them, and I think I forgot. I thought it might have been Pliny the Elder. But yeah, they discuss the Sadducees, but that's the only real reference we have to them. After the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, they disappeared from history. So if they're a mysterious group, it's just, to me, I look at them and I think, how could they only believe in the first 5 books of the Bible? But then I got to thinking about it. I thought, it's possible. You recognize that the first 5 books were literally dictated by God directly to Moses, who told him to write it down. You don't have that with any other writings in the whole Bible. None, except for a few parts of the book of Isaiah or Jeremiah, where God specifically told him to write one part of the message and roll it up in a scroll and go deliver it to the kings of Judea. But that's not, hey, sit down and narrate this whole book. That's just one little fragment. But with Moses, you've literally got this thing fully dictated by God. So I can understand why they have this great, fierce attachment to the Torah, but not the other writings. But that's where you would get. There's nothing explicitly in the Torah that talks about life after death. It's what Tracy was saying. It's like they're gathered to their fathers. But it is subtle, like Yeshua said, I am the God of the living, not the dead. So you kind of have to read between the lines there. But if you read those first 5 books, you're not going to see mention of the resurrection. It's certainly hinted at in more than one occasion, though.
But isn't it everything that Jesus did shows us we do the same thing?
Oh, yes.
He died, rose again. We are in him because we believe in him, and his blood that cleanses us, forgives us, and we raise again.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. So, it's interesting to me that Yeshua appears to Paul and says, you're a faithful witness and you still have some more witnessing to do. We're going to be going to Rome, you and I here currently, and give some more testimony. In what way was Paul a faithful witness regarding Messiah Yeshua? It's interesting that what is he referring to exactly? Yeah.
Well, he always retold the story of his on the road to Damascus, so he was a witness in that way.
That's exactly what I'm asking about, and I think that's literally it.
As soon as he saw that, he converted.
Yep. I think that's exactly what it is. That he says, you were a faithful witness to me here in the city of Jerusalem. And I'm looking back over what he said in the city of Jerusalem, and I'm thinking, what exactly did he witness and testify? He did not go out there and start arguing with people about whether Jesus was the Messiah or try to convert them in some sense. The only thing he did was give witness regarding what Jesus had done in his own life. That's a faithful witness. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of people, when they think about witnessing, that's not what they're talking about. They're not talking about witnessing regarding what God has done in my life. They're thinking, I'm witnessing and I'm going to tell you who Jesus is and what he did 2,000 years ago. I don't know that that's quite as impactful as telling someone, let me tell you who Jesus is to me and what he's done in my life. Because that's exactly what Paul is testifying about here, and that's what Yeshua commends him on, is giving witness. That is a faithful and true witness. Now, I know we can come up with 2 or 3 witnesses from the New Testament to say we can verify, Jesus was alive, he lived 2,000 years ago, but is that really witnessing? Not exactly. That's a history lesson.
When you said that, it just totally rang true, because when I met with some of the gals
Yeah.
here, and we were kind of just talking, and we were talking about, we decided to get to know each other better. How did you come to the Torah? How did you come to your faith? And we almost all had the same testimony. And it was all about what he did in our lives to bring us to where we were. And it was just really powerful. And it made me think, these are the things that build faith. These are the things that we need to be sharing and saying, look, this is where my life was, and it was bad. And look at where I am now. It has nothing to do with me other than the fact that I was seeking.
Yep.
And I came to him and accepted, this word. But it's really...
That is so much more powerful when your own life has changed. And people who knew you before can look at you and say, that's a different person. That is a faithful witness. And I think that, unfortunately, too many times we feel like we just want to give people a history lesson. It's kind of what you said there. It's like, and that's valuable, don't get me wrong. I mean, we want to tell them that, Jesus was a real person and he did this and that. But that's just not quite as powerful as saying, here's who I was and here's who I am now because of what Yeshua did for me. And my life has changed because of it.
But not just of my case and June's case, but every time we tell everybody about our story and how we met, and we think it was God, that a divine appointment with God that brought us together, because I was in deep depression.
Sure.
She was alone. She didn't really, but we brought us together. We both believe in God. We both, and and every time we tell somebody that, they just say, there's hope for me.
Yeah.
There's hope for me.
Absolutely.
Because it's a beautiful story.
Yes, it is.
He knows it.
I know that story. No, but I just want to encourage you,
And he's very specific when he answers prayers.
I know.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. So, seriously, just consider that. It's a matter of who are you and who did you used to be and what has Yeshua been doing in your life, and that's a really powerful thing. So I think we've pretty much covered. I had a couple of minor points after that, but I don't think they're quite as important as what we've discussed so far. There's a bunch of historical stuff, but I think we've nailed down chapter 24 fairly well. I'd like to thank you, and let's wrap it up and have some fellowship together.